Good evening, guys and ghouls, and welcome to another special supplemental episode of Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I am your host, Ian Garcia. Val Lewton came into RKO with a very simple mandate from his employers to produce horror movies. Well, that might appear to be a simple mandate, but it was more complicated than it appears on the surface for a number of reasons. For one, Charles Kerner, RKO's new president in charge of production, had a lot riding on his studio's new horror unit. RKO was a studio with financial prospects that were rocky from the start. Despite David O. Selznick's best but brief efforts in the early 30s, the studio had sunken into receivership by the end of 1933 due to its almost pathological over-extravagance and lack of efficiency, and would not get its head above water again until 1940. Unfortunately, the starry-eyed George P. Schaefer, who had assumed the presidency of RKO in 1938, virtually shot all that promise to bits when he hired Orson Welles to a contract guaranteeing him exclusive creative control of his productions. Schaefer, a student of David O. Selznick's unit production model and a devotee of the prestige picture, had failed to sufficiently rein in the new boy wonder's ego, and as a result had embroiled the studio in a massive public scandal with Citizen Kane and borderline financial ruin with the combined disaster of that film, the ill-fated Magnificent Ambersons, and Wells's aborted third project, It's All True. Kerner was thus left in the unenviable position of having to right the studio yet again, which could only be done through relatively radical measures. The unit production system, while efficient in some ways, needed to be completely overhauled in order to give executives more dictatorial control over the whimsical fancies of individual artists. Furthermore, RKO's B-picture production itself needed to be greatly diversified. With an eye towards the recent successes of some horror pictures, though especially those coming out of Universal, and particularly The Wolfman, Kerner was confident that RKO's own production unit, organized exclusively to crank out cheap, quick horror programmers, was just what the studio needed. But as far as Kerner was concerned, the studio couldn't just bank on modest successes that fell short of what their primary competition, Universal, was raking in. They needed something that was cheap, but could go big, on par with something like The Wolfman. Furthermore, they needed to be able to do it without access to the stuff that Universal could draw upon much more easily. Which is to say, RKO, in Kerner's mind, needed a hugely successful horror film, despite the studio not having an established history with the horror genre that would be perceived as an all but immediate stamp of approval to the movie-going public, despite the fact that they didn't have the best and most experienced technicians in terms of horror effects, design, and makeup, and despite the fact that they didn't have access to any name horror stars. That's just one avenue complicating matters. The other complication was that the man they hired to spearhead their horror initiative was Val Lewton. Though his disposition didn't show it, Lewton, who had spent the better part of a decade envying those who he saw as getting the opportunities he wanted, working himself to the brink but not receiving the same opportunities, was not at all keen at just cranking out monster movies. He was going to do what he had already done as an author, which was to take advantage of the low expectations and economic limitations that were carried by a pulpier genre in order to demonstrate their legitimate artistic potential. In his mind, Lewton believed that if he could accomplish this, all the while technically abiding by the letter, if not the spirit, of what his bosses were demanding, he would eventually find an avenue to producing the more personal projects that he really wanted to be making, and advancing his career as a producer of, for lack of a better term, legitimate films. The good part of this situation is that for decades to come, we movie buffs and especially horror fans got some of the best horror films of all time out of it. The not-so-practical issue with these sorts of clandestine motivations is that they do, in a sense, justify the kind of insubordination that are gonna be just as detrimental to someone like Lewton's reputation as if his works were consistently economically unsuccessful. Though only rarely outwardly combative, Lewton would end up assuming a more problematic tact as a self-managed auteur-producer, which was to simply ignore the demands of his bosses, acquiescing only when he reached the point where they gave him a clear ultimatum. And this is made all the more problematic because, for someone like Kerner, the efficiencies and even the qualitative benefits in terms of better movies that boost RKO's critical and public profile only work when an executive asserts sufficient dictatorial management and there is sufficient parallel of purpose and effective communication between the executive and his unit producer. Without that sense of balance, without that degree of communication and understanding, the relationship is doomed from the start, and regardless of how much money was made, it was going to be Lewton who was his own worst enemy in this arrangement, needlessly complicating and expecting far too much of a scenario that was almost surely never going to be an effective springboard to his being legitimized as a producer of legitimate films anyway. The reason I emphasize this is not to heap dirt on Lewton's untimely grave. I'm saying this in order to specifically combat the problem of meta-narratives that I addressed in the first supplemental episode of this trilogy. I may be doing so only to introduce its own limited, problematic counter-meta-narrative, but it needs to be emphasized that the story of Val Lewton's horror films is not simply one of an artist whose genius wasn't sufficiently respected in his day, or one whose work suffered from bureaucratic meddling by cold studio lizard people. Such a perspective flatly doesn't work with the very establishment of Lewton's producing career. From the very beginning, Kerner was specifically interested in giving horror a home at RKO, but he clearly must have been practical in terms of dealing with the social and cultural circumstances of the studio that he was managing. For all the pitting of Lewton's vision against the bean counting of the front office in the way we typically have it historicized to us, the fact of the matter is that Lewton came into his job at RKO with pretty much a sweetheart deal, one that was, for all its limitations, effectively proportional to the one that Orson Welles himself had been given, just at a B-picture level. As long as Lewton could make a film that did not cost more than $150,000, did not run over 75 minutes, was made under a title approved by the studio's front office, and stayed within the bounds of what production code censors would allow, he otherwise had complete creative control. And this was the way that Kerner needed it to be. Aside from wanting to balance the efficiencies of a unit production system with more centralized management of unit producers' potentials for excess, Kerner needed someone to whom he could just pass along a title and get a movie with a minimum of executive interference, not more. RKO didn't have horror stars, it didn't have the best horror technicians, and most importantly, it didn't have an established history, and thus an established internal studio culture that was familiar with how to make a horror movie. It's one thing to understand that you want certain semantic details, atmospheric settings, ghoulish monsters, etc. It's another thing entirely to know how to arrange and deploy these things in the kind of immediately successful way that Kerner wanted. You have to be able to hand the reins over to someone else to put your faith in them completely. You can't be getting bogged down in minutia when you have a whole other slate of productions to manage. Kerner gave Lewton those reins. Lewton got that faith in what he was supposed to be doing. But let's say you're given that sort of control, that sort of faith and trust in what you're doing. Let's say that while you're outwardly introverted and non-combative, what you can't really disguise is that secretly you harbor a lot of disrespect for what the people who hire you are trying to accomplish. That from the outset, all you're trying to do is leverage them for what you want to do. Maybe your position is understandable. Maybe you've been boxed out of a lot of opportunities that anyone could say you deserved for far too long. But at the end of the day, if someone asks you for one thing on a false premise of the two of you understanding that you want the same thing, and you give them something that completely flies in the face of their expectations, even nakedly condescends to or is insubordinate of those expectations in a way, even if the results are mutually beneficial to you both, what's going to matter more? The money or the miscommunication? The box office or the sense of confidence that someone else has placed in you? In his own way, in his own proportional way, Lewton was making his own prestige picture gamble. The first title that Lewton received from RKO's front office was Cat People, one that was apparently conceived by Kerner himself in the obvious interest of directly capitalizing upon, and some might even say ripping off, Universal's The Wolfman. Lewton was largely left to his own discretion in terms of assembling the film's major creative personnel, several of whom would end up being individuals who he had first met years beforehand while working for David O. Selznick. For a director, he tapped Jacques Tourneur, a French émigré who had been slumming it mostly making short subjects for MGM since the late 30s. Tourneur had worked intimately with Lewton on Selznick's 1935 adaptation of A Tale of Two Cities. With Lewton as the second unit producer and Tourneur as the second unit director, they were responsible for developing and staging the film's climactic revolutionary sequences, which turned out so well that Selznick, in a rare display of respect for his assistant's creative efforts on his productions, gave Lewton his first official production credit. The screenwriter of Cat People would also be a holdover from Lewton's days with Selznick. Lewton had previously been responsible for securing DeWitt Bodine, then a playwright, to work as Aldous Huxley's research assistant on Selznick's package production of Jane Eyre. Though Jane Eyre never materialized, Lewton remembered Bodine and was sure to recruit him in his efforts to ensure that the first horror film he made for RKO would not be some kiddie matinee monster movie, but an intelligent, psychologically driven, and adult-oriented thriller with a literary flourish. The cinematographer of the film would be Nicholas Musaraka. Musaraka had been working as a cinematographer since the early 20s, but with RKO's 1940 thriller Stranger on the Third Floor, he had developed a style of high-contrast, deep-focused photography that would parallel Greg Toland's work on Citizen Kane, helping to establish and define the visual conventions of what would later be known as the film noir. In recruiting Musaraka to photograph Cat People, Lewton clearly anticipated the necessity in his horror films not only being narratively, but also aesthetically distinctive. Indeed, Lewton would allegedly go far beyond simply working with his directors and writers to flesh out the story of his films. Mark Robeson had gotten his first big break as an assistant editor to Robert Wise on both Citizen Kane and The Magnificent Ambersons, but had subsequently found himself demoted to B Pictures after the studio's organizational shakeup following Kerner's ascension to head of production. Now the editor for Cat People, Robeson was surprised to find himself invited into development and writing meetings with Lewton, Tourneur, Bodine, and Musaraka, giving story contributions from the unique perspectives of his own discipline. As Lewton was assembling the close-knit creative circle that would be essential to ensuring that his horror unit would take Cat People and turn out the kind of horror movie everyone involved could feel proud of making, which wasn't necessarily what RKO expected or wanted of the division, it was even more important that he pin down precisely what kind of horror movie he did want to make. Hence, one of the first things he did after hiring Tourneur to direct the film was to organize screenings for both himself and his director of as many horror films as they could. From there, they could both more critically identify conventions that they respected in the genre, while also carving out cliches that they didn't want to repeat. Part of the problem with meta-narratives is that they tend to over-exemplify certain historical details in the interest of crafting a more compelling, even heroic story at times when it pertains to a certain respected or canonical artist. This is certainly the case with Val Lewton's output for RKO, especially his more forceful, dominant period as producer for his unit from 1942 through 1943. The legend of Val Lewton tends to portray him as a total maverick, someone who was a pioneer in means and ways within a popularly maligned genre, yielding works within the genre virtually without precedent, true originals, as it were. But as with any filmmaker's style, even that of a pioneering one, Val Lewton's style of horror film was historically contingent. In some ways, his films represented a radical departure from the norm, but in other ways, they represented something of a calculated reaction against the genre's overarching progress, a progress which he saw as an artistic corruption of some of the superior canon that came before. His films were in some ways prescient of forms of not only horror, but also crime and mystery films that were yet to cohere into their own distinctive cycles of film history, and were thus not fully appreciated until decades after they were released and written off by contemporary business people and critics. In other ways, they were doomed by their own retrenchment and nostalgia, representing the last gasp of a previous cycle of horror that had already run its course and was to be supplanted by a cycle that, for whatever complaints there might have been about quality of output, were more respondent to the topical interests and overarching changes of a new era. In a Saturday Evening Post article from May 23, 1942, George Wagner, the chief producer of Universal's top-line horror projects, is cited as giving the following 7 essential ingredients for a horror film. 1. They must be once-upon-a-time tales. 2. They must be believable in characterization. 3. They must have unusual technical effects. 4. Besides the major monster, there must be a secondary character of weird appearance, such as Igor. 5. They must confess right off that the show is a horror film. 6. They must include a pish-tush character to express the normal skepticism of the audience. 7. They must be based on some pseudo-scientific premise. Now, whether this quote represents Wagner's actual feelings about the essential ingredients of a horror film is subject to suspicion. There's a distinct possibility that Wagner never expressed any ideas of the sort as those to which he's being attributed to here in this article. If you think the days of earned media and embedded advertisement are new phenomenon, then think again. Mainstream journalism, especially film trade journalism, was profligate in planted stories and phony anecdotes cooked up purely by studio publicity departments in those days. Indeed, Universal would put out a large number of horror films over the course of the 40s, many or even most of which would not hew terribly close to these parameters. The Invisible Man and Mummy franchises, for instance, both evolved into storylines plotted in contemporary settings. They were not once-upon-a-time stories. Even the horror-adjacent Sherlock Holmes films were updated to the Second World War era, and who could forget the inner sanctum mysteries that the studio used as a star vehicle for poor Lon Chaney Jr. But if Wagner hadn't believed any of these things to be key ingredients to a horror movie, if this was all just some ballyhoo cooked up by the front office to drum up Universal's dominance of the horror market, it speaks volumes that this was approved to be the kind of message that the studio's executive class wanted to put forward to the American public. Here are the master chefs of the horror film giving you the straight dope on what makes a successful horror dish, i.e., here is what we believe, and we want you, the reader, to believe people want out of a horror film. This is what horror films are, boiled down to their rudimentary parts, no more, no less. From here, we perceive the early mapping out of themes that we have very well seen on this very podcast in our exploration of Universal's second cycle of horror films from this season, beginning with Son of Frankenstein on episode 5 and concluding with House of Dracula on episode 11. As far as Universal's front office was concerned, horror films whisked audiences away to a fairy tale Never Land populated by monsters, screwballs, and odd jobs. The horror film confesses right off that it is a horror film, keeping subtlety at the door, and dazzles the spectator with technical wizardry. Interestingly, this horror film recipe seems to dispense with notions of fear entirely. Supposedly, the monsters and hunchbacks should ground the film in some notion that it is at least there to shock or revolt the viewer, but the wording itself seems to emphasize whimsy more than nightmare, bombast and sensation more than jitters. More importantly, certain parts of this recipe seem to cancel out or contradict other ingredients. If horror films are once upon a time tales that must confess right off that they are horror movies without formality or pretension, then why is it necessary that there be a pish-tush character to express the normal skepticism of the audience? Wouldn't the presence of such a cliche be tiring and pedantic to an audience that has already suspended their disbelief at the door to this fairy tale world and its visceral delights of spectacle? And if it's fairy tales that people want, why the final emphasis on a pseudo-scientific premise? Why the demand for a modicum of rationalism amid all this insistence that you kind of just need to pick a setting remote in time and place, put a monster in it, and get the show on the road with a good explosive opening? But that's entirely the point. Val Lewton was hot on the development of cat people when this article went to the trades in May of 1942, and there's little doubt that he could have looked on it with disgust, if not at every ingredient, then at least with the principle of the thing. There are no ingredients to essential horror, any more than there is to any film in any genre. A film is not a cake, it's a work of art. What it is, what are its ingredients, evolve organically from the process of making it, crafting it distinctly and individually as a unique emotional and visceral experience. That likely wouldn't have been a sentiment to which his superiors would agree, but it was at the very least a deeply motivating rationale for everything that Lewton did. He must have believed in some part of him that he could not only make better films than George Wagner or his Universal cohort were making, but also that he could make films that were just as popular, that touched a nerve with audiences and fulfilled some need that the cynical commerce of the contemporary horror cycle simply wasn't meeting. But if Val Lewton disagreed with both the letter and spirit of what Universal's publicity department was putting out there, he was also clearly falling behind the times. The reason that the 7 ingredients of a Universal top-line horror production seem to be in such contradiction is because, as we not only addressed in our survey of Universal's second horror cycle, but also in our overview of Columbia's Mad Doctor films starring Boris Karloff, all of which came out before Wagner made The Wolfman or RKO even hired Lewton, horror was not just going through another cycle. It was in a period of profound transition informed by changing audience demographics, greater censorship, and a greater awareness of industrial, mechanical, and scientific advancements that very soon, especially after the Second World War, were about to completely reshape the way that the average American, including the average horror fan, understood the world around them. When understandings of the world change, so do understandings and expectations of the cinema and other popular art forms. With the first horror cycle of the early 30s, horror films tended towards gothic themes of internal corruption. Horror was intensive rather than extensive, emphasizing the role of the mind, temptation, obsession, desire, and madness. The fears it alluded to were the fears of a society that had experienced the First World War, the influenza pandemic, and a profound stratification of national wealth that had built up into a complete collapse of economic stability and the ruination of millions of lives. These were fears of losing control, of individuals vested with authority being driven mad by power, of the human being itself being violated, mutilated, and transformed into something monstrous, sometimes through invisible, infectious means. At the same time that they reflected profound distrust of corrupt elites of all kinds, they also betrayed a fear of corruption from other avenues. Foreigners who capture women in their gaze and molest them with their cadaverous hands, intermixing between whites and lower forms of humanity, invisible corruption through contagion and disease. The second cycle of horror films was what you got when one found the first cycle suddenly terminated, sat on for a good 3 years, and then rekindled by a sudden nostalgia for the films themselves. Gothic tendencies still remained, especially in the more prestigious examples of the horror films of the 1940s, but it's clear that in many ways, ghouls like Frankenstein and Dracula had been all but completely extricated from the motivating fears that birthed them. Now what was left was the allure of the monsters themselves, the pageant of state-of-the-art special effects, the promise of escape into foreign lands and mystified pasts. On the Universal side, certainly, even though Wagner started out with the veritably gothic Wolfman, the horror film developed into a kind of fantasy adventure. Visceral fascination was beginning to win out over the catharsis of fear, and there was no surer vehicle for exemplifying the technical fascination of the increasingly modern and aesthetically convincing fantasy film than the theme of scientific advancement. And here is where we bring in the Columbia Mad Doctor films. Again, all 4 of these films, The Man They Could Not Hang, The Man with 9 Lives, Before I Hang, and The Devil Commands, were certifiably gothic. But in their deployment of scientific progress and advancement as a crucial plot element rather than simply a theme of background or internal corruption, they went far further than the Universal recipe's pseudo-scientific premise. These movies were indeed remarkably prescient, and betray the extent to which the individuals involved in developing them did really seem to have an earnest interest in the scientific possibilities of the future and their attendant ethical dilemmas. These were not films solely concerned with eliciting terror or provoking shock and repulsion. They were speculative in nature. In other words, they were anticipatory of developments in and part of a trend in popular fiction that, as yet, did not even have a name and therefore was not even considered distinct from the contemporary fantasy adventure or horror films. But they clearly were distinct, and they were having a profound influence on the development of the horror genre as well, to the extent that the horror film itself was on the threshold of completely changing through this adaptation. The horror film, during the second horror cycle, was gradually evolving into the science fiction movie. In a certain light, one could argue that it's the Mad Doctor films, especially the Lovecraftian The Devil Commands, that ended up being much more immediately groundbreaking, at least as far as the horror genre and the subsequent science fiction film cycle, than any of Lewton's films. In reviewing horror films, Lewton and Tournier decided early on that whatever they did with cat people, they were certainly not going to follow the universal model of setting their story in a once-upon-a-time foreign setting. Lewton wanted his first horror film, his veritable thesis statement on his work in the genre, to be grounded, contemporary, and local in feeling. If there must be a monster, and RKO's front office clearly imagined a creature like Wagner's Wolfman, it would be an ambiguous one, just as much manifested by the mounting belief of the characters, powered by a psychological suggestion. Cat People would not confess its horror, it would slowly build it, working first to establish relatable, empathetic characters. If there must be some pseudo-scientific premise, a reasonable-sounding pish-tush explanation for the horror, it would be as close to real science as possible, particularly contemporary understandings of the science of the mind and human behavior. Otherwise, there would be no mad doctors or laboratories or surgical creations. It was not enough that the characters of Cat People all be normal people. We should see them doing stuff that normal people do, stuff that virtually no contemporary horror films adequately portrayed, if at all. Something as simple as giving his characters clear, non-eccentric professions and showing them at work was a radical departure in the context Lewton was working in. There would be expressions of skepticism, but that skepticism would then be meaningful and organic to the story. There would be attention to belief rather than merely suspension of disbelief. But, as Edmund G. Bansak points out in Fearing the Dark, there's as much repeated precedent in Val Lewton's work as there is deviation from the norm. And in the context of a genre that was gradually trending towards science fiction, Cat People just as much represented a regression as it did a progressive work in the genre, telling the story of an immigrant woman who is possessed by a pathological fear of human contact, believing that if she consummates her love for her recent husband, that she will be transformed into the titular monster and destroy him. Cat People is evidently a work of Gothic horror, one that derives considerable influence from classical works of horror literature and the previous cycle of horror films from the 30s. The focus is upon the notion of monstrosity rather than a monster. The monster, if it exists, is internal rather than external. The horror is intensive rather than extensive. Let's just rattle off some precedents and parallels. One of the most obvious is Robert Louis Stevenson's 1886 novel, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and certainly its 1931 Paramount Pictures adaptation directed by Ruben Mamoulian, covered in Season 2, Episode 12 of this podcast. A box office and critical success, Lewton would have had every reason to respect Mamoulian's film as a thematically dense, melodramatically relatable, and aesthetically groundbreaking work of art. But besides ephemeral inspiration in creating the story for Cat People, he and screenwriter DeWitt Bodine would have also had a fantastic narrative and thematic template. Like Cat People, the Jekyll and Hyde story is the story of a mind and soul torn asunder. Dr. Jekyll is a man possessed by latent desires that he is not at liberty to express due to the limits and conventions of the society around him. He believes that inside all men is the capacity for both great good and great evil, what we might, in the terms of Friedrich Nietzsche, characterize as the Apollonian and Dionysian impulses. A prototypical Jungian, Dr. Jekyll is a surgeon, but also something of an armchair psychoanalyst, believing firmly that the inability of contemporary society to reconcile the good and bad half of man, the inability to exercise or sublimate our Dionysian impulses to their fullest extent, holds us back from truly living up to the most beautiful potential of our Apollonian aspirations. Now, unlike Dr. Jekyll, Irina, the protagonist of Cat People, does not willingly let loose her Dionysian side of herself. Indeed, she faces a far different, less monomaniacal predicament. Unlike the mad doctor of a scientific romance and classical Gothic horror, she is convinced that the Hyde aspect of her personality must come out under certain circumstances, that it is an instinctive and inextricable part of her rather than a moral choice, and that it is beyond her control. Nonetheless, Lewton's film clearly alludes to the central kernel of horror of the Jekyll and Hyde story, which is the notion that this sort of dark half of the psyche, the regressive animal side, is not unique to the protagonist. It is a horrific aspect of the human condition that we all must reckon with, and that the horror film, in its own way, serves to sublimate and exercise, allowing us a symbolic playground to viscerally delight in the violence, sadism, and destruction that we secretly desire. That's just the most obvious thematic parallel between Cat People and previous works of Gothic horror, particularly from the 30s Golden Age films, but there's also Dracula, which we covered in Season 2, Episode 1. Again, there are obvious differences between how monstrosity is presented in both films. Bela Lugosi's Count Dracula is straightforwardly unsympathetic, whereas Cat People is presented as a tragedy about Irina's unique psychological predicament. At the same time, both films betray fears and suspicions about the foreign, and there's a very thin line indeed between the violence of the films and the sexual, which doesn't even rate as subtext in terms of how obvious the association is. Like Dracula, Irina is an emigre from some remote, vague Eastern European country with a dark occult past where what Western Europeans deem to be merely antiquarian superstitions are manifested as realities. Though outwardly sympathetic and, like Dracula, even alluring in her exotic foreignness, she carries with her a lot of baggage from the old country, and her intermingling with a native son like Oliver, the man she falls in love with and marries, portends the dangers of mixing bloodlines, tainting legacies, and carrying on the degenerative aberrations of her ethnic stock. Perhaps we can interpret the distinctly melancholy tone of Cat People and the sympathetic portrayal of its titular monster as once again biographically rooted. Lewton himself was an ethnic European, and he had certainly been treated like something of a wild thing whose very nature would sully his beloved wife Ruth. Like Dracula, Arena's sexual threat is represented as predatory and consuming. Whereas Dracula is associated with the vampire bat and the wolf, Arena is associated with the big cat. The symbolic association between particularly feminine forms of gothic monstrosity and the cat is certainly as old as legends of witches and their favorite paramours, but there were also significant antecedent works of literature and film that either directly or indirectly informed the development of cat people. The three major sources of short fiction most frequently cited include Ambrose Bierce's The Eyes of the Panther from 1897, Algernon Blackwood's Ancient Sorceries from 1906, and Margaret Irwin's Monsieur Seeks a Wife from 1934. All of these stories deal variously with themes of witchcraft, knightly transformation, the tension between the occult and rationalism, superstition and insanity, and romantic advances being undermined by monstrous forces from within people. Lewton, as it happens, had also previously written his own were-cat story, the Bagheeta. Published in the July 1930 issue of Weird Tales, it deals with a young hero living in a remote Cossack village in the hinterlands of Ukraine, who, while undergoing a rite of passage, realizes that one of his village's central legends of a demonic feminine shapeshifter is indeed a lie fabricated in order to maintain social cohesion, particularly around masculinity, manhood, and patriarchal religious authority. It's possible to interpret the story from a biographical perspective as being deeply informed by Lewton's being raised in a household of two strong, independent women, and its consequent influence on a pattern in his writings where he explores the ways in which so many constructs of conservative femininity and masculinity are based around social constructions rather than empirical realities. One can certainly see in Cat People as Arena tells the story about her village's legends of the evil, devil-worshipping cat women, as well as the role of the great King John of Serbia in Christianizing her pagan ancestors, a variation of this theme. Inasmuch as the association between monstrous femininity and the cat is crucial to the film's occult symbolism, so is the association between the conquering Christian John and his phallic sword, penetrating the cat itself. It is also possible that Mary Elizabeth Councilman's pulp story The Catwoman, another Weird Tales publication from 1933, had some influence on the filmmakers. There is very little in the way of parallels in terms of its plot, but Councilman's story being more of a supernatural mystery, it does feature a foreign woman and shapeshifter as its centerpiece, and more importantly, is set in a contemporary city. Once it became obvious to the filmmakers that they wanted Cat People to be as far from a once-upon-a-time story as possible, which in practical terms may have also been more economical, the relationship between DeWitt Bodine and Lewton's final screenplay and its antecedent works became increasingly superficial. Nonetheless, investigation of each of these works illustrates in various ways the narrative, symbolic, and thematic precedence of Cat People in antecedent works of Gothic horror. And for what it's worth, there was at least one film from the golden age of horror that featured a female cat person before Cat People. I am, of course, referring to Paramount Pictures' Island of Lost Souls, covered in Season 2, Episode 13. An adaptation of H.G. Wells' 1896 novel The Island of Dr. Moreau, a prime sensational selling point of the film became Kathleen Burke, who portrayed Loda, the Panther Woman. Another of the mad Dr. Moreau's unholy creations, Loda physically appears to be a woman, but is actually a panther that Moreau has changed through advanced vivisection. Loda was never really as voracious as she was portrayed by Paramount's publicity department, the poster proclaiming, "The Panther Woman lured men on, only to destroy them body and soul." But Loda nonetheless proves to be a key point of psychosexual horror in the film. Unlike Arena in Cat People, she was never fully a woman, nor does she behave as such. But like Arena, Loda is a creature who transforms, or who has been transformed into a ghastly thing by penetrative, horrific means beyond her control. She is a tragic and sympathetic figure in the narrative. Also, like Irena, Loda is coded by her associations with exotic ethnicity, and her attempts to seduce or mate with the male protagonist of Island of Lost Souls betrays contemporary racist fears of racial and cultural intermixing through the allegory of bestiality, much as the later attempt by the ape-man Uran to rape the heroine of the film echoes similar fears, but reframed by a patternistic depiction of a coded black man lusting after a white woman. We could go on and on like this, but let's just go ahead and focus on the two aspects of Lewton's movies, particularly Cat People, that are the most often cited as exemplary of his role, again, per Criterion Collection's release of the film, as someone who, quote, redefined the genre. There is, first, the grounded contemporary modern setting. Second, there is the psychological dimension of his storytelling, the notion that Lewton, more than any previous horror filmmaker, masterfully played on the spectator's fear of the unknown, of the border between reality and fantasy, using subtlety and suggestion to stimulate their imaginations to conjure up their own worst horrors. First of all, as we've outlined just recently, even contemporary to the horror cycle in which he briefly came into some prominence, Lewton's decision to ground his films in contemporary modern settings was not altogether out of the ordinary. But as we're still at the point where he's just making Cat People, and his main objective in terms of Kerner and the RKO executives' minds is to make works that can compete with Universal's top-line Once Upon a Time horrors like The Wolfman, but for less money, let's let it slide that in the year 1941, Cat People really was something decidedly unique. Indeed, even with other contemporary horror films of the period, even their contemporary settings are not nearly so grounded, in the sense that they don't reflect Lewton's attention to dramatic details. Again, one cannot understate the importance of just seeing the characters in Cat People going to work, doing their jobs, living everyday lives, not needing to go outside of the borough of Manhattan to suddenly find themselves thrust into a world of horrors. That must have been really something for contemporary audiences, and even in retrospect, it's the dramatic authenticity of Cat People that looms above pretty much all other horror films of the 1940s cycle. But one doesn't need to look too hard into the preceding horror cycle to see where Lewton might have gotten some inspiration for the importance of a contemporary setting and attention to a kind of social realism in his filmmaking, especially at a point where he mainly considered his competition, as his employers did, Universal's fairy tale stories, which he equally detested, but for completely different reasons. During a cycle in which Universal was much more dominant of the horror territory, and in which competition was much leaner, the proportion of horror movies with a contemporary focus was much more pronounced. Even leaving aside any number of borderline horror films, works that were just particularly macabre mysteries that got a convenient new packaging when horror came into vogue, Universal's The Black Cat from 1934, The Raven from 1935, both took place in contemporary settings, although the dreamlike structure of The Black Cat could be said to totally disqualify it. We covered both films in Season 2, Episodes 9 and a patron-exclusive bonus episode, respectively. But notwithstanding, over at MGM, both Todd Browning's Mark of the Vampire and Freaks are contemporary films, with Freaks, covered in Season 2, Episode 10, especially reflecting a far more earnest investment in exploring the socially realistic dynamics of the characters' day-to-day lives. At Paramount, we may discount the exotic locale of Island of Lost Souls, but not so the virtually unknown Murders in the Zoo from 1933. Indeed, RKO's 4 borderline stabs at horror from the Golden Age, The Most Dangerous Game from 1932, and King Kong, Son of Kong, and The Monkey's Paw, all from 1933, traded heavily upon their contemporary trappings. No doubt the auteur Marion C. Cooper, who produced all 4 of these films, was just as heavily invested in the relatability of his far-flung exotic adventures as Lewton was in his more localized, homespun fantasies. More than any of the other majors, however, Warner Brothers, already the de facto studio of the working man, pioneered the more grounded contemporary horror film with Dr. X in 1932 and Mystery of the Wax Museum in 1933. These were covered in Season 2, Episodes 14 and 15. Though the constantly wisecracking, manic, pithy characters of these films may appear terribly old-fashioned, even stereotypical of the time today, it needs to be emphasized that Warner Brothers films in general became quite popular precisely because, in lieu of being able to offer the same kind of prestigious spectacles that their more landed contemporaries could offer, they focused on making films that were more relatable to everyday life and became particularly iconic as it related to the emergent, hustling and bustling conception of urban Americans. With Mystery of the Wax Museum in particular, their horror movies were similarly against the grain enough in that they were, for their time, pioneering. It not only lacks the exotic or far-flung trappings of its contemporary horror films, but it also dispenses with the stuff-shirted pretenses or poetic overtures of other studios' output. These are gothic horror films, but in an all-but-totally modern vernacular. Glenda Farrell's no-nonsense, socially independent girl reporter's quest to hunt down the hot scoop on who's behind all the bodies gone missing from the city morgue stands in stark contrast to the ponderous, romantic struggles between good and evil shown in Frankenstein or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde or Mad Love. In anticipation of Lewton's own more grounded kind of horror movies, they are also just as much anticipatory as Lewton's films of the film noir, of the transmutation of borderline horror and mystery into its own kind of crime and thriller film about the unique corruptions of the modern day. Since I hope I can trust that my listener will already be well into our survey of Lewton at this point, that I can for the moment move on from Cat People to include the subsequent Leopard Man, Seventh Victim, and The Ghost Ship, let's also just acknowledge that as far as references to borderline horror, that Lewton's filmography from 42 to 43 increasingly tended away from any kind of even suggestion of the supernatural to a more borderline subject. The Leopard Man, despite the clear wishes of RKO's front office, was not a correction for what he had made of their intended Wolfman ripoff in The Cat People. It is not the story of a man who turns into a leopard when the moon takes him or whatever. It's a murder mystery in which a homicidal maniac uses the chance escape of a captive leopard to commit a series of crimes. The Seventh Victim includes a satanic cult, but the cult never actually does anything above and beyond the activities of any other criminal organization in a crime movie. Indeed, some might say they do quite a bit less, and The Ghost Ship, I suppose we can call it a prototypical example of the film noir, but surely by this point, RKO executives couldn't have been surprised when a movie called The Ghost Ship did not, in fact, turn out to be a terror film about a haunted boat. Or, at the very least, some sort of mystery where part of the plot is that, in standard borderline horror mold, the hauntings are just a ruse for some criminal activity. But no such thing as a part of the film. It's just the story of a maniacal boat captain and a third officer who suspects him of murder. What I'm trying to get at here is simply this. To the extent that Lewton may have made some films that were exceptional in terms of their being packaged as horror films, while remaining grounded in at least some attention to dramatic and psychological credibility, especially in their contemporary setting, they were also clearly regressive. They were inasmuch harkening back to the gothic horror, borderline mysteries, and old dark house thrillers of the golden age as they were trying to do something new. Lewton was looking at where the horror film was going, and in his own films trying to turn the clock back to what he thought made the original master's works so compelling. and as a result, his works are stunted in terms of their immediate prescience or groundbreaking quality. Even in terms of their aesthetic contributions to the development of film noir. I have already pointed out in episode 8 of this season how Roy William Neill and George Robinson's work on Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman clearly points in the same aesthetic direction as their more grounded horror, borderline, and crime film contemporaries, and in a context that could not have been farther from what Lewton aspired to with his own cinema. What's more, Columbia Pictures' less acknowledged Mad Doctor cycle had already proved both contemporary and grounded in its own unique way, and was, in addition, prescient of not only the emergent science fiction film, but also the aesthetics of the film noir. And the poetic irony is that it was going to be a veteran of that very film cycle who was, very soon, going to prove to be another rival to Lewton for the attention of RKO's executives, by whom I mean Edward Demetric. But before we get to that, let's just touch on that second of the two most cited exemplary aspects of Lewton's filmmaking, his manipulation of our fear of the unknown. I don't think it's anyone's place to argue that Lewton's films, particularly Cat People and I Walked with a Zombie, aren't exemplary in terms of exploring precisely this aspect of horror. But when that becomes the primary praise of someone's work, I'm sorry, I kind of have the same reaction to when it's praised in Lewton as when it's praised in, say, the works of H.P. Lovecraft. It's a fair comparison because numerous critics and scholars have compared the two and suggested Lewton's likely influence, or at least awareness of Lovecraft's literature. But if someone says that what is exceptional about Lovecraft is how he stokes fear of the unknown, or worse, that his works are about fear of the unknown, I'm sorry, that always struck me as the shallowest, vaguest praise you could ever afford an author or artist. Fear of the unknown is one of the most bog-standard, contingent elements literally informing almost every genre of non-conventionally dramatic popular art, whether we're talking about horror, or mystery, or adventure, or fantasy, or even science fiction. There's more than enough room for praising artists as masters of the rudiments, because rudiments really do matter in order to build something else on top of it. But I'm sorry, again, the fear that Lovecraft stimulated was not at all as vague as fear of the unknown. The fear embedded in Lovecraft's works were always historically and culturally contingent and very specific, often to the point of Lovecraft literally spelling them out in his stories. Lovecraft stimulates fear of apocalypse, fear of man losing his sense of centrality and an ever-expanding knowledge of his universe, fear of the decline of white civilization and the ascendancy of what Lovecraft considered to be inferior races. Sometimes he was just in fear of gross stuff like bats or octopuses and sea fungi, which is how he described and cobbled together a lot of his monsters. Rats too, he's scared of rats. And inasmuch as he attempted to get his reader to imagine something more horrifying than he could describe, he was also not at all above straight up describing something in verbose detail that he hoped would simply shock or repulse them and give them some visceral pulp joy out of just that. The same is true of Val Lewton. Val Lewton was very good at stimulating fear of the unknown when he wanted to in certain very specific films. But that is not what Cat People or I Walked with a Zombie, much less The Leopard Man or The Seventh Victim or The Ghost Ship are about. Cat People is about the cold, alienating nature of modernity, the inheritability of trauma, the fear of one's own passions and desires, and the thin line between what is real and what the mind makes real. It is also not for nothing with Irina's psychiatrist, who turns out to be attempting to groom her for his own pleasure, but whose expertise on the nature of the mind is quoted at the beginning of the film, about the horror of those in positions of access to great knowledge and authority also being fundamentally untrustworthy in terms of how or whether or not they will use this knowledge to actually help, as opposed to exploit those in desperation and need. You also see this theme come up again in The Ghost Ship. It is also about the notion that, to certain people, there will always be the inescapable notion that life just isn't worth living. That, like Irena, There is no hope for some individuals but a death that they have made heroic and romanticized in their own minds. In other words, Cat People is a work of Gothic horror. It is a work that, hearkening upon the establishment of the Golden Age horror cycle, explores conceptions of monstrosity, even though Lewton's employers just wanted him to make a monster movie. Lewton is also often described as a pioneer of psychological horror, but psychological horror itself is really just an echo of horror's Gothic roots. The only difference is a shift in focus away from one historically and culturally contingent preoccupation with notions of sin or moral corruption to a new historical and cultural conception of uncontrollable, non-choice-based aberrations and anomalies of the mind. In either case, within the immediate purview of 1942 and 1943, Lewton's films may have been narratively, thematically, and aesthetically progressive in many ways, but they were also definitively regressive in just as many ways. And it is that regression, that pulling away from the more immediate progression of the horror genre to a new form of adaptation, the adaptation of the monster and science fiction movie we discussed in part 1 of this series, that was going to be a big part of what bedeviled the prospects of his career as much as anything else. Who knows if Lewton might have felt comforted to know that one of his future collaborators, Kurt Siodmak, had gone through a similar disappointment in the development of The Wolfman as he was about to in the production of Cat People. As long as we're talking about parallels between Lewton's work and those of his antecedents and contemporaries, it really should be said that Cat People, while not being a monster movie in the mold of The Wolfman, certainly has its thematic parallels. In particular, both films are distinctly tragic in tenor, focusing on characters who are victims of powers beyond their control, doomed by fate rather than some flaw or sin on their own part. There would have been another parallel, though, in that both The Wolfman and Cat People, at least, gesture at the situation of their stories in some liminal space between the real and the unreal, between the rational and the imagined. And Kurt Siodmak's original conception of the film was much more explicit in this regard, and closer to the film that Lewton would ultimately want to make himself. Siodmak didn't just have Lon Chaney Jr.'s dad explain to him as some kind of pish-tush character that everything was happening to him was a product of his own mind. Originally, there was to have been no explicit reference to the Wolfman itself. Eventually, though, Wagner and the Universal execs opted for just putting Chaney in another of Jack Pierce's patented monster get-ups. In the same way, Turner and Lewton got pretty far into the production of Cat People without ever making it explicit whether Arena really was or wasn't a shape-shifting cat person. And then, of course, Kerner and RKO insisted, no, go back and do some reshoots of a panther for inserts. We've gone with you this far. We're not having you make a movie called Cat People where there's no cat person in it. And so those inserts got stuck into the film, and of course they just didn't work. And RKO execs still hated the movie. This wasn't what they had ordered. Following its November previews and its premiere at the Rialto Theater in New York City on December 5th, critical response was middling to negative, with some reviews being outright vicious. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times called it, quote, tedious and graphically unproductive. Wanda Hale of the New York Daily News called it, quote, a great example of Hollywood's waste of precious time and valuable material. But in the build-up to the beginning of its general release on Christmas, the film built up a considerable word of mouth and earned itself a key defender in Manny Farber at the New Republic, who called it, quote, the best Hollywood film in 3 years. Suddenly, the film that both Charles Kerner and Lou Ostro had dismissed became a sleeper hit in the following year of 1943. Against its modest budget of $135,000, it grossed over $1 million. Convinced that they had a dud on their hands, RKO's first genuine horror film in a decade was now doing numbers comparable to what Universal's The Wolfman had done. In the matter of a couple of months, Val Lewton had gone from being chewed out by Lou Ostro in the RKO screening rooms to getting a new provision added to his contract, one that allowed him the option, upon completion of his third front office assigned B picture, his own A-level production. By the spring of 1943, Val Lewton had a lot to feel optimistic about. With the nationwide release of his follow-up production, I Walked with a Zombie, at the end of April, he and Turnier had another major low-budget hit on their hands, and thus pretty much the assurance that even if the films he made were not at all pleasing to his employers, they were vindicating his faith in his own devotion to making B-level prestige pictures, meeting the challenge of the front office's juvenile pitches head-on to produce movies with taste that the general public, surprisingly, seemed to enjoy very much. In some respects, it may have even seemed that his relationship with Charles Kerner, if not Lou Ostro, was significantly improving. Kerner had never thought poorly of Lewton personally. Indeed, there would be times in the next 2 years in which his efforts to cultivate Lewton's production unit seemed to genuinely synchronize not only business-wise, but creatively. When Lewton had been handed the title of his third production, The Leopard Man, at the end of November, soon after I Walked with a Zombie had wrapped principal photography, one would have had justification to suspect that the front office was just trying to box the producer into making cat people again, but this time the kind of cat people that they wanted. But nonetheless, RKO proved amenable to acquiring the adaptation rights to Cornell Woolrich's novel Black Alibi, though it was clearly not the story of a man who turned into a leopard, and when The Leopard Man was finally ready for principal photography, he maintained the same level of creative control as he had on The Cat People and I Walked with a Zombie. It's hard to say, but the executives at the studio couldn't have been too dissatisfied with the results. A more grounded, less literary, borderline horror mystery that was, particularly in its first killing scene, much more explicit than Lewton's previous output. It didn't make nearly the splash as I Walked with a Zombie or Cat People had, but maybe the film in and of itself proved some comfort to Kerner and Ostro that the relationship between themselves and their iconoclastic auteur-producer was becoming more manageable. Even the title that Kerner gave Lewton for his fourth project, The Seventh Victim, was significantly less lurid or obvious than the previous 3 front office mandates, further assuring Lewton and his inner circle of creatives that the executives themselves were calibrating their expectations, attempting to meet them somewhere in the middle of good populist business sense and artistic suggestion and subtlety. What's more, Lewton had one more reason to be optimistic about The Seventh Victim. Kerner and the other RKO executives were prepared to bump it up to an A picture. Lewton would have the same creative control as he had had with his previous productions, and more. He'd have a bigger budget, a longer production schedule, and no running time restrictions. But for as much reason as there was to be optimistic, there was just as much reason to be cautious. And in retrospect, it's easy to see how the most prolific and independent time in Lewton's tenure at RKO would prove replete with red flags of an all but inevitable fall from grace. Though Cat People and I Walked with a Zombie had done well, neither of them approached the crown jewel of RKO's B releases of 1943, that being a certain propaganda film called Hitler's Children. Adapted from Gregor Ziemer's Education for Death, a polemic detailing the Nazi indoctrination of German youth, Hitler's Children would go on to be the 4th highest grossing film of the year, and RKO's most successful production. Most of the shine that Val Lewton could have hoped to maintain was all but immediately snapped up by another of the studio's recent acquisition, the film's director, Edmund Demetric. In another bit of poetic retrospective irony, Edmund Demetric had been signed on to the studio in the previous year after leaving Columbia Pictures, for whom he had directed the final of its Mad Doctor films, The Devil Commands. Though the Columbia Mad Doctor movies were certainly more sensational than Lewton's works, they were, as I have pointed out before, nonetheless notable for both their creative parallels to Lewton's films as well as the extent to which they progressively anticipated, more than Lewton's proto-noir and gothic horror, the evolution of the second horror cycle into the science fiction of the next decade. And The Devil Commands, in particular, significantly blurred the lines between modern science fiction and classic gothic horror to an extent that even seemed to anticipate Lewton himself. Starring Boris Karloff as a bereaved scientist whose attempts to contact his dead wife leads to him accidentally opening what could be described as an interdimensional gateway, and adapted from a novel that was written literally decades before the existence of black holes became the stuff of mathematical and scientific consensus, The Devil Commands, while a compromised work, built a considerable and subtle tension on the line between scientific rationalism and superstition, between what is real and what the mind makes real, which would be themes that dominated Lewton's own gothic horror films. As Fintan McDonough acknowledges in his 2021 book, Edward Demetric Reassessing His Films and Life, Demetric was not a filmmaker who could be assigned the same status as an auteur. His oeuvre lacks overarching themes or aesthetic signatures, and he never settled in a particular genre. He was, nonetheless, as with Lewton and his creative circle, instrumental to the establishment of an aesthetic on certain films that would contribute to the development of the film noir. More importantly, for our narrative purposes, he was coming right out of the gate at RKO with a major B-movie success that highlighted him as a person of interest, somebody whose attention to detail and ability to produce a quality product on limited resources could be cultivated for more prestigious top-line productions. Lewton never personally begrudged Demetric, even respecting him as an artist. But when push came to shove, and when Kerner and the rest of RKO executives eventually saw the possibility of combining Demetric's and Lewton's potential, his need for creative independence, and more importantly, exclusive creative control on his productions, ultimately injured the progress of his career as the star of his friendly rival continued to rise. From his own perspective, Lewton may have seen his position as untenable anyway. He may have felt that the only way for him to advance his career on terms amenable to his sense of not only his creative independence, but also his personal and professional obligation to his inner circle, was to gamble once again on proving his superiors' instincts wrong. Although the success of Cat People had led to a provision allowing him the option of an A production, the assignment of The Seventh Victim shortly after the release of I Walked with a Zombie, and while The Leopard Man was still in production, may have suggested to him that the executives were trying to keep him boxed into a production schedule that was calculated to rein in his ambitions, to keep him so focused on what they wanted that his passion projects would continue to languish in development. Such suspicions would hardly be unjustified. With the success of I Walked with a Zombie, it soon became apparent that RKO was intent on separating Lewton and Tourneur, cultivating the latter, just as with Demetric, for bigger productions. Months before receiving the commission for The Seventh Victim, and within a week of principal photography beginning on The Leopard Man, the studio had already announced to the trades its intentions to produce a sequel to Cat People. In March, as The Leopard Man was wrapping, they further announced the intention of producing a double feature of two recent horror acquisitions, the projects being titled The Amorous Ghost and The Screaming Skull, the latter likely being an adaptation of Frances Marion Crawford's 1908 short story, which in turn inspired the notorious 1958 indie horror film of the same name. What's more, any hopes for The Seventh Victim getting produced as an A picture ran aground of RKO's refusal to support, in Tourneur's absence, Lewton's decision to promote editor Mark Robeson to director. By June, Lewton was looking at a production slate of at least 6 projects. The double feature idea for the Amorous Ghost and the Screaming Skull had gradually morphed in his mind to focus on developing the Amorous Ghost as a comic fantasy romance as opposed to a horror film. Kerner wasn't so enthusiastic, instead encouraging Lewton to make use of a standing merchant ship set from the studio's 1939 adventure film Pacific Liner to make a quickie thriller called The Ghost Ship. He was also still mired in development of The Curse of the Cat People, which had its production postponed until principal cast of the first film could be acquired again. There was also Are These Our Children, a projected social problem movie to be adapted from an as-yet unpublished Look magazine photo essay of the same name dealing with the juvenile delinquency epidemic, to be co-produced by Demetric and Lewton, with Demetric set to direct it. Finally, there was They Creep by Night, an intended monster rally cooked up by RKO's publicity department that would have combined the monsters of Cat People, I Walked with a Zombie, and the as-yet unreleased The Leopard Man in a single film, intended to emulate the success of Universal's Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. With The Leopard Man set to be released at the end of the month, clearly nobody in the publicity department had seen the film and thus realized that there was no Leopard Man monster to be exploited in such a film. Of these 6 projects, only 3 of them, The Ghost Ship, The Curse of the Cat People, and Are These Our Children, would ever be brought to some kind of fruition. But Lewton's heavy development and production slate had already begun to take its toll. As we already covered in our patron-exclusive episode on The Leopard Man from this season, the creative ambitions of Lewton's productions were starting to conflict far more with the intense budgetary limitations and time constraints under which they were produced, with the climax of the film proving rushed and sanitized compared to Woolrich's source novel. The situation with The Seventh Victim was little better when we covered it on episode 20 of this season. Originally scripted as an A production, but suddenly going before the cameras in May with the same limitations as a B picture, the results are as evocative in terms of their atmosphere as Cat People and I Walked with a Zombie, but the plot and dramatic credibility of the characters' motivations is a complete mess. While one of Lewton's most visually iconic productions, it is also easily one of his most pretentious, suggesting an increasing compensation for the pulpy margins within which he's struggling, rather than a confident meeting of the challenge. The Seventh Victim would also prove to be the beginning of a cascading series of misfortunate events that would befall each of Lewton's successive productions of the second half of 1943 and well into 1944. Some of these calamities you could place squarely at the feet of RKO, some unavoidable circumstance, and some Lewton's own obstinance and stubbornness. Indeed, each calamity would increasingly arise from some combination of all 3. The RKO brass once again hated what Lewton did with the creative freedom he was given on The Seventh Victim. In addition to finding the film itself convoluted, they were also growing increasingly concerned with the morbidity of Lewton's themes, finding them distasteful and impossible to pitch to their conception of the average moviegoer. What's more, with a projected release in late August, its box office prospects were immediately under threat of being swallowed up by Universal's own top-line summer release, George Wagner's lavish color remake of Phantom of the Opera starring Claude Rains as the Phantom. Delaying the release for Halloween would only place it in competition with another Universal prestige venture, an ambitious anthology film called Flesh and Fantasy featuring Edward G. Robinson and Barbara Stanwyck. Even if it had made sense to them, The Seventh Victim had virtually no hope of competing, especially with Universal dropping twice the cost of the average Lewton production on just the publicity for both films. There's also the possibility that, murmuring in the background of all this, was what Lewton was doing with The Curse of the Cat People. Nobody could have imagined that an assignment as simple as a sequel to Cat People would have gone in the direction that Lewton was taking it. To those in the know, particularly the incensed Lou Ostro and the baffled Charles Kerner, it became gradually apparent that Lewton not only had no intention on producing the kind of horror movie they expected, but that he had no intention on producing a horror film at all. Instead, Lewton was developing a coming-of-age drama that was completely disconnected from the original film in all but its principal cast. Indeed, as Dad and I noted on Season 1, Episode 28 when we discussed the film, Lewton's Curse of the Cat People effectively retconned the events of the original film's ending just so he could maintain the ambiguity of the magical elements of this new film. Though technically being about a young girl whose imaginative disconnection from reality isolates her from other kids and proves a point of consternation for her father, Irena's husband from the first film, Curse of the Cat People was gradually evolving into a biographical work exploring the complexities of childhood development and psychology and the difficulties of parents in adjusting to the idea that they might not have normal children. Irena in this film would not make an appearance as an insidious Catwoman, but as the protagonist Amy's imaginary friend. Drawing heavily from Lewton's own youth and his troubled childhood growing up in Port Chester, the producer even tried to persuade Kerner to let him change the project entirely, retitling it Amy and Her Friend. Kerner, obviously, refused. With zero confidence hovering in the background coming from the executives, Lewton's messy proto-noir The Seventh Victim was premiered in August and released in September as planned, but with zero official promotion. It would prove to be the worst performing of Lewton's films for the studio up to that time. With They Creep by Night all but written off after The Leopard Man came out, and with no movement on the Amorous Ghost and the Screaming Skull, Lewton still had his hands full by the end of August, with The Ghost Ship wrapping principal photography, The Curse of the Cat People finally entering production, and Are These Our Children still taking shape. What's more, the auteur-producer was still intent on making good on his option for an A picture, despite his rapidly diminishing cachet with the front office. Already a workaholic by nature, Lewton's own physical and mental health began to suffer not only under the strain of his obligations to the studio, but also because of his continued insistence on maintaining strict oversight over virtually every aspect of his productions. In an interview with John Brosnan, screenwriter DeWitt Bodine described how this situation inevitably led to the deterioration of his professional relationships, even among those of his already overworked inner circle. Quote, "The whole arrangement could have worked out fine because in the beginning Val was a marvelous producer, but then he attempted to do too much. He tried to move into every department, which was unfortunate. Val was the only producer in the American sense of the word to whom the credit producer really applied. People give him credit for the whole thing, and in a way, they're right. It's just that it became impossible for Val to work with anybody, and he couldn't do it all by himself. It would have been marvelous if he had just stayed as producer and father to the whole project, but he wanted his hands on everything. He became very difficult to work with and very nervous, and a story session became a trial instead of a joy it once was. You had to be, eventually, a very patient person to work with him." It's apparent that by this point, Lewton was becoming just as much a victim of his own mismanagement of his priorities as he was legitimately underappreciated by his employers. His need for creative independence was revealing itself to be more obsessive and pathological than principled. The despondent, monstrous side of him, like one of the human monsters in his pictures, whether we're talking about Irena from Cat People or the villainous captain of the Ghost Ship, this monstrous side of him was becoming harder and harder to sublimate. His obsession with control inevitably led him to advocate for more exclusive responsibilities when he should have been more open to compromise and cooperation. In the case of Are These Our Children, Madeleine Demetric, Edward Demetric's wife, had already done a considerable amount of topical research for the project, she and Edward collaborating on fleshing out John Fontaine and Herbert Klein's original treatment based directly on the Look magazine article, which had since then been published at the end of September 1943. Amazingly, Lewton, not interested at all in making a sensational social problem film that would offer only sanitized pat solutions to the problems of juvenile delinquency, managed to persuade Charles Kerner to drop Demetric and allow him to put Mark Robeson again in as director, even though this would again mean that the film would lose any chance at the studio's A-picture backing. In the interest of crafting a story about authentic youth experience, not just youth crime, he brought in the 16-year-old Ruth Clifton of Moline, Illinois, to act as a technical advisor, Clifton having established the youth center movement that eventually spread across much of the Midwestern United States as an outlet for unsupervised young people who might otherwise engage in delinquency. He and Ardell Ray, who had originally been hired from RKO's Youth Writers Project to rewrite Kurt Siodmak's original pass at I Walked with a Zombie, subsequently went to work heavily revising John Fonte's screenplay. In the meantime, The Curse of the Cat People had gone into principal photography on August 26. With a projected shooting schedule of only 18 days, Gunther Von Fritsch, the first-time feature director that Lewton had no doubt hired in order to keep the film as far away from the studio's interference as possible, had managed to shoot only half of the screenplay. Kerner and Sid Rigel, replacing Lou Ostro as supervising producer of the studio's B units, stepped in, firing Von Fritsch from the project and promoting the film's editor, Robert Wise, to finish shooting the film by October 4th. When a rough cut was finally previewed for RKO executives, they were more incensed with the results than they had ever been before. Are These Our Children, now titled The Dangerous Age, had already gone into production on November 3rd. Now, Kerner and Rigel were insisting that Curse go back for an additional week of shooting beginning November 21st to both reshoot scenes as well as add new sequences that made the connection between it and Cat People more explicit. Used to handling productions back-to-back, Lewton was now effectively juggling two at the same time, in addition to post-production on The Ghost Ship, which, as was becoming the norm with his productions, was inefficiently outgrowing its modest demands. The Dangerous Age had turned out to be its own nightmare. While RKO had given the little film the biggest promotional campaign that any Lewton project had ever gotten before, it had unintentionally invited the scrutiny of the State Department. Objecting to Fonte's original screenplay, which, according to Edmund G. Bansak in Fearing the Dark, quote, fingered the blame for juvenile delinquency upon a national war effort whose fervency minimized time and opportunity for proper parenting, it had been deemed problematic to morale and national security. Already struggling against the typical demands of the Production Code Administration, Lewton and RKO were now literally dealing with the interference of the federal government. Initially, the State Department had advised the filmmakers to drop the film from their production schedule entirely, the Office of Censorship warning that they might refuse the finished film an export license. Instead, RKO went ahead with it, but with the concurrent disaster of Curse of the Cat People fresh in their minds, insisted on imposing more supervision over Lewton's process, for the first time ever demanding to see daily rushes rather than awaiting to see a finished preview. The whole thing took 7 weeks to shoot, wrapping on December 21st, literally days before The Ghost Ship was set to premiere. As for The Ghost Ship, it went into wide release on February of the following year. And here, a whole host of new problems began. Suddenly, RKO and Lewton found themselves being hit with a plagiarism lawsuit levied by two authors, Samuel R. Goldling and Norbert Faulkner. Goldling and Faulkner had submitted the unsolicited manuscript of a story and play to Lewton's offices about a month or two before Ghost went into production. Though the manuscripts were ultimately returned to the writers, Lewton could not deny that he had them in his possession when he was still finalizing the script for the film The Ghost Ship alongside his old friend Donald Henderson Clark. The plaintiffs, initially suing for $50,000 in damages, were willing to settle for just $700, but Lewton absolutely refused to budge on his innocence, and the pending suit dragged along for the next year and a half before even going to trial, proving another black stain on Lewton's reputation. Then came March, and The Curse of the Cat People was ready to premiere. The reaction was, as ever, mixed, with even Lewton's small cohort of critical defenders, such as Manny Farber of the New Republic and James Agee of The Nation, offering only qualified praise, noting the film's obvious compromises and unrealistic conflicted expectations. Lewton's most personal film to date, it failed to stir much passion or enthusiasm from the film-going public, although it did manage to accrue a small cult following of educators and child psychologists who were in a better position than anybody to appreciate what Lewton was trying to do with it. By the end of March, The Dangerous Age was getting its preview at the RKO Hill Street Theater in Los Angeles, unhappily paired with the Danny Kaye musical comedy Up in Arms. The preview was an utter disaster, and the Office of Censorship made good on its promise of refusing the final film an export license. RKO, in turn, postponed the film's official release for at least another 5 months, insisting on extensive reshoots to remove any scenes deemed too controversial, including an entire subplot in which an abused teenage boy murders his father. With a credible lawsuit, a certified bomb, and a film that was literally being opposed by the State Department hanging over his head, timing could not have been worse for Lewton. After all this, he was still right in the middle of another production, another passion project, which had started principal photography literally 2 days before the premiere of The Dangerous Age. The amazing thing is that, way back in June when the project was first greenlit, Charles Kerner had been optimistic, for once, about one of Lewton's personal pieces. Juggling everything else on his plate, Lewton had made it his top priority to make good on his option for an A picture, with an adaptation of the French author Guy de Maupassant's 19th century satirical stories Mademoiselle Fifi and Beau le Suif, intending to fuse them into a single narrative. He was more confident than with any of his other projects that, with Kerner's backing, this would be the thing to put him over the top, to vaunt him out of B-movie obscurity and making the kind of A-level pictures he really wanted to make. Unfortunately, RKO wouldn't officially approve Mademoiselle Fifi as an A picture, though Kerner did compromise by granting Lewton an enhanced budget of $200,000. Unfortunately, RKO wouldn't officially approve Mademoiselle Fifi as an A picture, though Kerner did compromise by granting Lewton an enhanced budget of $200,000. If Kerner was optimistic, Sid Rigel, on the other hand, certainly was not. With all the chaos surrounding The Dangerous Age, it was impossible to see how this new film, if it didn't court the same degree of controversy, would certainly fail to inspire a wartime box office. Published in 1880 and 1882 respectively, Beau le Suif and Mademoiselle Fifi are both stories that take place during the Franco-Prussian War, immediately conjuring up allegories to the contemporary Nazi occupation of France. In the former story, a stagecoach of characters representing the various classes of French society make their escape from the besieged city of Rouen only to find themselves stumbled into occupied Prussian territory. Though treated with civility by a Prussian officer, they realize that he intends to hold them indefinitely hostage until one of them, a patriotic prostitute named Beau le Suif, will consent to spending the night with him. Initially taking le Suif's side in the matter, remembering her charity towards them on their travels, they eventually conspire together to convince her to relent to the officer's demands. Soon freed from captivity, they now treat le Suif with the same prejudice and disregard as they did at the beginning of the story, extending to her none of the same charity as she extended to them. Lewton's idea for the film, to be written by Joseph Michel and Peter Rurik, the former having made uncredited contributions to Curse of the Cat People, was to combine the basic structure of Beau le Suif with the latter, more patriotic and violent story, Mademoiselle Fifi. In that story, Mademoiselle Fifi is the nickname of a German sub-lieutenant given to him by his fellow officers in reference to his effeminacy. Fifi is one of 5 officers in the Prussian army who are currently living out of and making a squalor of a chateau in the town they have occupied. Reined in and interminably bored, the officers order their men to collect a group of local prostitutes to dine with them. One of the prostitutes, a Jewish woman named Rachel, ultimately stabs and kills Fifi in an act of patriotic defiance, leaping from the window and waiting out the rest of the war in the bell tower of a local church. There are obvious exceptions that Rigel would have taken with the project, of course. There was no way that the Production Code Administration would approve a story that in any way acknowledged prostitution, for one. But more particularly, Rigel was concerned with yet another of Lewton's choices of dour subject and theme. While at once extolling patriotism, the story also satirized the hypocrisies and cruel prejudices of the times in which they took place. With Bolesuif in particular, de Maupassant paints a picture of occupied France in which, far from patriotic defiance, the average person is all too ready to go along to get along with the brutish Germans. Indeed, there is the explicit acknowledgement that, among the most elite of French society, there is an identification across lines of class and hierarchy, and allegorically, through the sacrifice of Bolesuif, there is also collaboration with the enemy for the sake of convenience. The allegorical significance of such a story was, in Rigel's mind, particularly dangerous, and just asking for more scrutiny from the State Department at a time when the United States was actively at war, ostensibly allied with a free France and against German aggression. Now was not the time for stories about inequality or the inherently dehumanizing nature of war. Furthermore, unlike numerous propaganda films produced between 1942 and the end of the war, Mademoiselle Fifi would not end with a redemptive depiction of human resistance, but with a harsh portrayal of complacency in the face of foreign adversity. Rigel even went so far as to try to directly undermine Lewton by slashing his budget from $200,000 to $150,000, forcing Lewton to go right back up the chain of command to Kerner to get the budget punched back up again. The dispute between Rigel and Lewton eventually grew so bitter that, at Lewton's request, Kerner finally agreed to replace him as Lewton's supervisor with another producer, Jack J. Gross. This, predictably, did little to improve the situation. Gross's disposition towards the project, and towards Lewton's personality, was not an improvement over Rigel. Furthermore, Gross had previously been an executive producer for Universal, a man behind the scenes on such notable projects as The Wolfman, Phantom of the Opera, and Son of Dracula. His paranoia no doubt mounting with the increasing strain placed on his personal health, Lewton became convinced that not only was this another subtle attempt by RKO to undermine him, but that Gross himself bore a personal grudge against Lewton because his horror films had been better and more profitable than his. Mademoiselle Fifi wrapped principal photography on April 22nd, a few days over schedule, just as Curse of the Cat People was going into its ill-fated general release. It received its own preview on June 29th. As was becoming all too common, it went over poorly. By this time, RKO was all but done with Lewton, and Kerner had lost his patience. The studio put virtually zero publicity behind this B prestige picture, and when it was finally released in August, Mademoiselle Fifi, Lewton's ticket to ride, proved to be the worst performing of all his films up to that time, again. Oh, and The Dangerous Age? Well, it was significantly reshot, re-edited, and finally released in September as Youth Runs Wild. Having been proposed all the way back in June of the previous year, the experience of making the film and the bastardized results were so dispiriting to Lewton that he requested that his name be taken off the project entirely. His request was denied. Less than 2 years ago, Val Lewton had been handed the kind of deal that most producers at his time, especially those inspired by the likes of Irving Thalberg, Darryl F. Zanuck, and David O. Selznick, could only dream of. In no time at all, he had turned himself into both one of the studio's least popular, but also most valuable assets. But in the long run, one can only conclude that those meddling executives may have had a point. At least a small one. Lewton was the classic case of a person whose reach, almost as a personal rule and commitment, exceeded his grasp, a one-man band microcosm of the very cycles of prestige and over-extravagance that had inspired and then hobbled so many of the major studios, to say nothing of the very studio he'd gone to work for. He had tried mightily to prove that even the smallest pictures could be made with dignity, and especially in retrospect, he certainly proved that. Well, really, he proved that the pictures could have dignity. But the studio, the people he worked for, Lewton himself, for all involved, the dignity of art itself proved a Sisyphean concept. It was too remote, too bound up in Lewton's own neurotic preoccupation with what his struggle was supposed to mean, what it was all intended to prove or actualize. One can't help remembering the boy who never could hold down a steady job, got fired from his first journalism stint for making up a story, performed and sold angsty teenage poems on a street corner under a feudal pseudonym, chafed at every kind of authority, and, in response to his fears, learned to love the darkness of his own mind, the silence of his own loneliness. With the boulder of all his work now tumbling down the hill, only Lewton could know, taking those first few steps down after it, what was it all supposed to mean? What was it all supposed to have been for? The irony is that, subsequent to all of these stupendous failures, including, by his own estimation, significant artistic ones, Lewton was finally about to get some breathing room. Taking stock of its own investment, RKO were no longer going to give him the same degree of creative freedom and, by the same token, the same workload. Over the next 2 years, Lewton would only produce 3 more horror films for the studio. With Kerner's passing in 1946, he would once again find himself suddenly out of the job. He floated first to Paramount, then to MGM, where it had all started for him, and finally to Universal, producing 3 respective films along the way. In between, he, Wise, and Robeson had made an earnest go of starting their own independent company, but when old habits proved to die hard, Wise and Robeson ended up terminating their professional relationship with Lewton, cutting him out of the plans. He was a kind man, a good friend, but he had become impossible to work for, especially now that Wise and Robeson themselves had gone on to their own successful and manageable careers. Lewton was on the verge of signing on as an assistant producer under Stanley Kramer at Columbia Studios when he suffered a serious heart attack and landed at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. He passed away on March 15, 1951. He was 46 years old. At the risk of getting as convoluted as the 7th victim myself, let's cycle back a bit. It's sometime in mid-May of 1944. Curse of the Cat People isn't doing well, The Dangerous Age is postponed and about to undergo reshoots, and nobody is optimistic about Mademoiselle Fifi, which is currently in post-production. One day, Val Lewton gets called into Jack J. Gross's office. Even if Val is still holding out hope that Mademoiselle Fifi will prove a sleeper hit, he knows his goose is cooked as far as what RKO will allow him to get away with. Indeed, that's exactly why he thinks Gross, this ex-Universal man, is here. To put him in his place. To tell him the blank check has bounced. To tell him that he makes horror movies, and if he didn't know before, he's going to be told now how to make them. Gross is the sort of man that Universal publicity drop on the recipe of a horror movie was written to describe. If Lewton's idea of the horror film lent too heavily on a regression into the gothic prestige of yesteryear, if he was a bit too behind the times of where popular consciousness and visceral obsession with spectacle was going, then he had more than met his match with Gross. Gross was going to ensure, just as another cycle of horror film was experiencing diminishing returns at the climax of the Second World War, that RKO's horror unit was going to be even less prescient than ever. Lewton still had a soft ally in Kerner, but Kerner, like Lewton himself, was overworked, overstressed, and his health was increasingly suffering for it. Gross was about to have a lot more say in what RKO horror movies looked like, and, as predicted, this meant that RKO horror movies were going to look a lot like Universal horror movies. They were going to be Once Upon a Time tales. They were going to confess, right off, that they were horror shows. And this meant, ironically, that in addition to being given a lighter workload, the time and ability to more fine-tune the productions he was working on, Lewton was also about to get a big boost in budget to make more conventional, more prestigious-looking, more gothic-trending horror films. The only thing that was missing was a name horror star, the thing that everybody at RKO was sure to be the thing to really put them over the top. Lewton trembled at the name that Gross mentioned. He very well could have wept even. And yet, in another bit of poetic irony, he had little reason to. Though Lewton feared more than anything being forced to make dumb, juvenile monster rallies, he had no idea that Gross and RKO were about to provide him with another close ally in his fight for the artistic dignity of the horror film. The actor whose ephemeral influence he so dreaded on his productions, just by being attached to them, would prove to be literate and deeply sympathetic to Lewton's view that the worst horrors are those conjured in the privacy of one's own mind, and that the best horror movies are the ones that stimulate us through the subtlety of terror, not the crudity of bombast and violence. This name horror star himself had grown bitterly disappointed in the types of garbage he had been compelled to work with, and was in sore need of an auteur like in the old days who would fight for a vision rather than for a buck. Neither Lewton nor Gross, of course, knew that yet. All they knew was the name on the contract. On May 18th, 1944, at a salary of $600 a week per picture, RKO had signed Boris Karloff.